Ladies and gentlemen, JJ Taboola of Ugandan origin is an investment industry professional with postgraduate degrees in mathematical statistics and economics. He spent the last decade working at the front line of the top asset management companies in South Africa. In his most recent role, he was an institutional fund manager for a $45 billion asset management firm operating out of Cape Town. Currently, he is the founder of a social business investment platform in Nairobi called Prime Circle Africa. Welcome very much, Mr. Taboola, and it's a pleasure having you here. So, JJ Taboola, welcome very much to this session. In a quick bit, I want these people to introduce themselves. We'll start off with Salom.
Yeah, this is Salom Ajima. I'm from Ghana. I'm a project management practitioner and a youth trainer with Action Aid Ghana.
My name is Jennifer, and I'm doing a master's in international educational development here at Sussex. I'm a success right tutor. I'm a teacher in Nigeria, where I come from. And so I started an educational initiative called Teach for Change Nigeria. And what I do is basically try to find creative ways of teaching literature.
Hi, my name is Esperance. I'm a student taking my degree in environmental science in Kenya, African Nazarene University. I'm a young entrepreneur, so definitely look forward to this conversation to see how you've handled your thing and see what I could pick out from you. Other than that, I'm working with the Youth Cafe, and currently for the past 1 month, we've been working with Emma and Anthony in curating this whole program of Lockdown Live series. Thank you so much.
So I'm Katie. I work for Sussex Rights, and I've taught for Sussex Rights and helped to run the blog and do some bits for the website. And I've just finished a degree in English and hoping to do a master's in gender studies next year.
Hi everybody, my name is JJ Taboola. I am an investment professional by training. I've got a background in mathematical statistics and economics, postgraduate. I've spent the last decade or so working in asset management. My most recent role was as a fund manager, and today I currentely own a business run out of Kenya, Nairobi, by the name of Prime Circle Africa. I'll delve deeper into that as the session goes on.
Welcome very much, Mr. Taboola, and it's a pleasure having you here. So the first question is, what can you describe as your role in business?
In business is that of a founder of a startup, co-founder of a startup. As I mentioned earlier, we're based out of Nairobi. I moved here in December of 2019 with very eager ambitions to sort of change the game here. Prime Circle is essentially a social business networking platform that gives members access to whether it is funding or investment opportunities around the East African market or outside the East African market. It also aims to grow people's lives socially and professionally, and that's with using a myriad of various either pre-negotiated things that we have come up with businesses outside of Prime Circle. So I'll say, for instance, let's say for instance we have a negotiation with a gym or an arrangement with a gym. Then Prime Circle members will be able to go to that gym at discounted rates, etc. And it would be a gym that is in keeping with, let's say, Prime Circle's principles, etc. And I mean, that's just an example. But you know, we've basically built a network of a whole lot of different businesses that are able to tap into this network, and members are therefore able to also benefit from the networks that we've established. And another thing is that a lot of these guys have also come into Prime Circle with existing strengths, and we basically leverage off those strengths to help other members and members of the public as well.
Thank you very much for that. I will now invite Salom for the second question. Salom.
Great. Really great profile you have there, JJ. So my question is, from your perspective, what has been the biggest challenge you have faced in business with COVID-19? What has been the most important or useful intervention, whether it came from you, your staff, the government, investors, or from someone or somewhere else to help your business during this time?
Thank you for the question. I'll start off by giving you a little bit of background. So I moved to Kenya from South Africa at the end of last year. So that's December 2019, and the aim was to launch Prime Circle. I worked through the festive season, January and February, to get the premises to where they are today, and we officially launched the business in March 2020. By the first week of March, between 80 and 90% of all the business capital was spent. It was clear in week one that the idea was well received in the market. And even though we had launched and we had potential signups and people following up, in the second week of March, the president came out to announce the lockdown and the curfew in Kenya. So Prime Circle's business model highly depends on social interaction, and the lockdown was the last thing that we needed at that point. So that was essentially the beginning of our problems. We did not have a line of sight as to where revenues were going to be coming from. We had no indication of how long the lockdown was going to go on for. It's very difficult for members of the population that have lived in a completely normal world to imagine that a global lockdown can go on for months. So naturally, I tried negotiating a rental reprieve with the landlords, and that failed. I tried contacting various members who had expressed access, people who had actually signed up but not paid yet. And the general consensus was that it just doesn't make sense to pay for a service that you cannot access. And so the business either had to find an external source of funds, or we had to shut down operations completely. So during the subsequent weeks, there was a lot of talk in the media about companies such as airlines filing for insolvency, bankruptcy, holding companies selling off their stakes in some of the subsidiaries that they hold. And obviously companies some companies that could wanted to realize their proceeds and sit in cash, and other companies that already had debt on the balance sheets simply needed to file bankruptcy. So in addition to that, family and friends were calling me, because of my background in investments, asking me, telling me that their stock portfolios are down 50%. What should they do? Should they sell out? What does the future look like? At that time, the oil price had also had also hit record lows, and this became a daily occurrence for me, taking calls from people asking what to do, what the future has in stock for everyone. And it made me realize one thing, is that I actually had a skill set to provide people who either were struggling in their personal lives financially, or their businesses were struggling. And so I came up with an idea of, giving people some kind of financial guidance. So one day I decided to shoot a video highlighting the basics of saving, budgeting, and investing. And the video turned out to be quite well received in the market, and it was widely shared across the globe. 6 weeks later, today, I have clients in, calling for that I give financial guidance to in Nairobi, Kampala, Budapest, New York, California, Johannesburg, etc. And so I think the moral of the story here is that I evolved as a business owner, and I tapped into a skill set that I already had, which has helped me to monetize and to rescue my business from potential insolvency.
Thank you, JJ, for that response. Just like you have already established, the COVID-19, of course, did affect economy and businesses, and education too is another field that has been drastically affected by the pandemic. and then the sudden move to online learning, and I think the whole situation when it comes to education begins to make us question what really matters in terms of the content that we teach kids. Is it enough to just know math, English, science? What are these essential skills that are really needed? Because now we're no longer in school as we would normally be, and it's, of course, there are different changes happening depending on what part of the world. But then there's this sudden thought, like we begin to rethink education. What matters most really when we say education? What exactly do we even mean? So from someone from the business field, I'm wondering if we're going to think about what education should be like going forward, what sort of skills or what kind of system educationally would you envisage or suggest? What are the skills that really matter? What should schools be like post-COVID?
So I'm going to sort of twist that question around, and I'm going to also answer it from a very African context. So to date, pre-COVID, education in Africa boils down to access and affordability. So you have kids that are in rural areas that simply cannot get to a decent school in an urban area, and those that can actually get to the decent schools simply can't afford it. So I think it's more of a question of access to education as opposed to what exactly is being taught. COVID-19 has also brought about a lockdown that has kept kids in urban schools, so kids who actually have access to education, at home. And what these urban schools have done is that they've turned to online teaching, as you've mentioned earlier. And what I would like to see happen is that I feel as though we need to move forward and open centers for education in remote rural parts of Africa, with a large screen, a sound system, a good internet connection, and you can have a teacher sitting in Belgium or in the UK or in Australia or in South Africa, imparting knowledge with a class of about 100 bright young minds sitting in a village somewhere in Africa. And literally all it takes is internet connection, lockable facilities, and the right sound and visual equipment. So I feel as though a lot of nations, or the world doesn't tend to look at education as human capital development, but that's essentially what it is. So education is human capital development, and what we need to keep our minds on is the fact that somewhere out there are children that have been highly capable that did not get the opportunity to go to school that could potentially have found a vaccine for this virus.
Thank you, JJ, for being here. So now I'd like to ask a question in an environmental perspective. Well, yes, there are other dimensions, being economic, being health, being educational perspectives affected by COVID-19. But over the recent 3 or so months with COVID-19 being here, reports from CNN, Climate, and UN Environment say that there has been a drop in the levels of pollution and drop in the level of effects of climate change. However, we acknowledge the fact that after COVID, infrastructural projects, manufacturing businesses have to still get kickstart and get back to their feet. And this might have a ripple effect to the environment. In what ways might you think differently about business modules, business journeys, on how they're going to impact the environment to the negative?
Much for the question. You're very right in saying the pandemic has been very good for the environment. The world has continuously had a very long debate about, a very academic debate about climate change, whether it's real or not, and coming up with weird and wonderful metrics to calculate our footprint on the Earth. But one thing that the human race, the one thing that we're all sure about is that the human race is absolutely destroying the planet, and at an increasing rate at that. So what we have failed to do as a human race is to come up with actual solutions and to put capital behind these solutions to actually arrest climate change and some of the environmental issues that are out there. And I think that the reason why, in my view, is that people simply do not have the long-term ambition to go after the problem. So that's number one. Secondly, capital markets don't reward that kind of decision-making. And, you know, it's very sad to think when many of us are going to be grown and have children and will have grandchildren one day, and we simply will not have a planet worth living in that we are handing over to the generations that will come after us. And yet nobody is doing anything about it. The predicament that politicians find themselves in is that, you know, call it a moral dilemma, but they have to be seen doing things. They have to be seen making movement, and their performance is based on movement and not necessarily progress. So they're trying to achieve tangible goals like building a road, etc. Whereas, you know, that may not necessarily be the best thing that we need. We might need internet in those village schools. So we might need to get education to the right people, you know. So that's my 2 cents on the environmental issues that we have at hand.
Hi, thank you. That was so interesting about it's literally proven that people who deny climate change was a thing are obviously now wrong, because Corona's proven that it's improved changed the climate in a negative way. So thank you for raising that. Building on the previous question, in your opinion, what does the future hold for the economic sector, generally speaking, but specifically the employment sector? And what practices and behaviours do you see ending forever? And what new practices and behaviours do you anticipate will become even more important because of the situation that COVID's brought around?
There are a lot of potential behavioral changes that we can expect to see at the end of this global pandemic. I think that we can sit around and try and predict what these will be. But I think it's probably more valuable to look at the existing evidence that we see in the world today. So if we look at China, they began to lift their lockdown in late February, sort of early March. And the numbers tell us that the economy or the economic activity has recovered to about 90% of what it was pre-COVID. So a lot of people have returned to offices, a lot of guys have returned to factories. However, they're simply doing that because they have to. They're not spending money on going out, they're not eating out, they're not drinking out, they're not going to bars, etc. And they're also not heavily investing in anything. So this means that the supply side of the economy has recovered. However, the demand side of the economy has not recovered, which further implies that unemployment will be quite high. And unfortunately, people working in the restaurants, tourism, bars, shops, etc., will lose their jobs as there's simply no demand for their services. So it's quite unfortunate. And I think while things will potentially go back to normal one day far in the future, we can expect that the next phase, or we can expect in the recovery period of the economy, we're going to see high rates of unemployment and job loss.
COVID future. Let me welcome Amos for any question that he may have for you.
So the question I wanted to ask Elion is, we have seen that people's working life have changed completely in the last few months because of this kind of COVID-19 and the stuff. So what advice will you give to the young people seeking employment in the post-COVID environment?
So yeah, indeed, people's lives have changed significantly during lockdown. At the point we find ourselves in now, if somebody asked us to have a face-to-face meeting, that would have to be one very, very important meeting. You would have to prove that you can truly add value. And it would have to be, sort of a high heartbeat, someone who has actually proven themselves to add value over the long term. So my thing to young people seeking employment is that you need to add value. You need to add value. I can't stress that enough. I did a video, the video I mentioned earlier that I did a few months ago, 6 weeks ago. One of the things I said is that you need to be able to craft out a skill for yourself that people are willing to pay you for the skill, and you can actually dictate how much you get paid on an hourly basis over time. The concept of an exploratory conversation over coffee is just not going to fly in this day and age anymore. And this means the same for business travel. This means the same for leisure travel. And I think it's also going to have a huge impact on innovation. So while we have proven that we can work from home effectively, the reality is that young people in the workforce, if they're not working from home, they are going to miss out on those networking effects of being in an office. Those networking effects are what actually help their future careers. The camaraderie that people have between that you build within your teams, that might all be lost in a work from home culture. So I think that's something to potentially worry about in the new sort of work style. But I can't stress enough how important it is to become good at what you do and be known for that thing, because that's what will essentially help you to keep your skill set.
Thank you very much. Now, the last question is about what are your hopes for the future, a post-COVID future that is socially, politically, and economically?
So I'll answer this question by sharing a story, just to give some background. So in 2017, I had a near-death experience, right? I was mountain biking in Cape Town, and I rode off a cliff. And unfortunately for me, that nobody actually saw me falling off this cliff. And so I waited about 4 hours to be rescued and eventually taken to hospital. My biggest fear was obviously death. And second fear was living paralyzed, so living the rest of my life in paralysis. And thinking back to those 4 hours while I was waiting for help, it's actually quite remarkable how little I deemed important in my life at that time. And subsequently, I spent months in rehabilitation. I underwent a series of surgeries, and I got all my movement back, luckily. But when I came out, I had a clear presence of mind, because for about 4 months, all I had to do was to lie in bed, and I got time to critically think. And combined, it was that ability to think, and I had a renewed long-term mindset for the rest of my life. And I always said to people, that was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because I feel like people need to go through a near-death experience in order to appreciate and actually take control of the lives that they're living right now. And it's crazy, it's a crazy statement to say, everyone needs a near-death experience. But I actually think that this is what COVID-19 has actually done for the world, is that people for the first time have just had to stop and have realized that, death could happen to anyone. I mean, sneezing, coughing, inhaling a virus, and in 2 weeks' time you could be deceased. And unfortunately, over the past 15 years, the world has adopted this increasingly short-term mindset. So we, in the wake of social media, we live in this like tweeting, twerking, liking, sharing, posting world. Like that's literally all that people seem to be doing. And it's basically a world of instant gratification and a huge influx of information that 95% is meaningless. So we live in a world of misinformation, fake popularity. Very sad to see that our journalism industries or journalism has sort of lost credibility. with misleading headlines just to attract the right reader, or just to attract readers. People's concentration spans are significantly lower today compared to the way they were 2 decades ago. And you guys will agree with me when I say that the attrition rate of responsibility of the job attrition rates of millennials in the workplace is about 20% every 5 years. So imagine a company trying to build something sustainable over time, but every 5 years you have a brand new team. It's completely unsustainable. So what my hopes are that people adopt a very long-term mindset and try to build businesses that have a positive impact on a significant portion of the world's population. The only way that we can achieve that is by building businesses that are technological. The concept of a brick and mortar company simply cannot have that kind of reach. Excuse me. Brick and mortar can't have that reach anymore. And I think business owners have to think very carefully about building things that can that can stand the test of time. So COVID-19 has shown us that your business might be recession-proof, but it's not necessarily pandemic-proof. And those businesses that are potentially pandemic-proof and that are well thought through, they're not very obvious businesses. They tend to grow very organically and very slowly. A very good example of this is Amazon. Jeff Bezos, he's a mastermind for having come up with a concept and was willing to put in, some decades of hard work and potentially take losses in order to build a sustainable business like Amazon today. And, unfortunately, on the flip side, the businesses that we have in our market today are businesses like Snapchat and TikTok, where it literally revolves around how many users and followers that they can accumulate. And very quickly, they want to flip the business, cash out and move on to the next big idea. It's a very Silicon Valley kind of a way of thinking. And the sad thing is that that's where a lot of the world's capital actually goes to, because capitalism rewards that kind of thing. So this thing about having a long-term mindset with measurement periods over truly meaningful timeframes is something that I would like to see more coming out of this. And a deep thought process where a couple of guys sit down and be like, guys, listen, over the next 7 to 8 years, let's build something that's going to truly change the world. And this is essentially how we'll solve global issues. People can no longer afford to sit in the passenger seat. You need to get up and seek that capital. You seek the opportunities that you believe will drive the world. Because when you have capital, then your voice can be heard. So if your primary goal is to put food on the table and to put clothes on your back, unfortunately, we're not going to necessarily develop as a global population. We cannot sit back and wait for political leaders to come and dictate and tell us what's going to happen. A lot of the time we are bashing some global presidents whose names I won't mention, but for their tweets and the like. But the reality is we need to start imagining of a world where we can potentially use an app to say where we want our tax money to be spent. I mean, imagine living in a world like that. So we need to work hard to make our opinions heard and relevant. And I believe that when enough opinions are out there and enough of us have money to, we're backed by investors and we're putting the right opinions and views out there, diversity of opinion essentially becomes democracy.
Thank you very much for those insightful remarks, and also for just painting a picture of your vision to us for a post-COVID future. Thank you for coming through, JJ, and also for just sharing your thoughts on the various questions that we had presented. It's good to see that moving forward, we have some people who are playing not necessarily for themselves, but also for the entire team, which is the human race. And that is what was endorsed in the Ubuntu philosophy, and I believe we're truly living up to it. Thank you for also mentioning that education needs to be approached in such a manner that it takes the shape of the development of human capital, because I feel that will help solve many of the issues that we have and avoid flooding the market with skills that are not necessarily needed or not necessarily going to be there for the next 5-10 years. Also, your comment on a business that is necessarily recession proof but is not pandemic proof, and how business owners need to look into business and realize that they need to also reinvent themselves in the process of this COVID. And indeed, it is true that COVID may be that near-death experience everybody has gone through, and that when getting out of this, we may have our clear goals. We may start businesses for those who want to start businesses. So thank you very much for the wisdom that you've shared on here today. And to the audience, thank you very much. To the panelists, thank you very much for your questions. So have a good one ahead. And yeah, that's it from our side.